My name is Sengupta and today is the 14th of January 2015. I was 16 years old. I was a high school student.
Nice.
In June 1984 I was in Delhi. We had just finished, I think, it was summer vacations, I remember it quite clearly. Well, I mean, I'd heard about events in Punjab in the time leading up to June 1984 because it was in the papers all the time and in the news. And also there was a close friend of mine who was Sikh, and she was quite. We talked a lot about what was going on in Punjab at the time, and about Operation Blue Star and what was happening around it. So it was. I can't say I was unaware. Although at the time the details were not that well known. I mean, we knew about Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale and what was happening at the Damdami Taksal and so on. Those things I remember, and then that there was a military operation and that there was large-scale violence. The details are something that I have figured out for myself much later, but I was aware that something terrible was going on. In June, I remember that June, the papers came out, and after the operation, and there were television interviews. There was interviews, I think, with the armed forces officers who were in charge of the operation, and there were lots of rumors and discussions. Of course, I mean, I heard my parents talk about it. I heard neighbors and other people talk about it, and nobody seemed to know very much, except that there was this tacit understanding that things had gotten out of control and that they had to be reined in through some kind of military operation. Nobody knew what exactly had happened inside. I grew up in a family that has never really accepted the official version of historic events in India. So it was not. I can't say I was deeply skeptical, but it seemed to me probable as a 16-year-old, and you must remember I'm 16 years old, and I'm hearing all this in the news, and also it was a very different time. No? There were no other alternative outlets, sources of news. There was no other sources of discussion. For instance, you heard what you did, but I was somewhat skeptical of the idea that that everything had happened so quickly and so quote unquote efficiently and cleanly. I did think that was something that one needed to think about. I remember it very clearly, and I have written about it. I was in school, we were in school, and we heard the news on the announcement was made. Everyone's first response was to ask who were the assassins, because that would determine everything.
Okay.
When it was known that the assassins were the Sikh bodyguards of the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, the immediate response was, I mean, and I could say this immediately, is that my then girlfriend was a Sikh woman. My first concern was, what are we going to do? And I asked her, how are you getting home and what's going to happen? I remember making the trip back with her in the school bus, but we stayed quite far away from each other.
Okay.
But I said, I'm going to go with you and make sure that you get home. I mean, I don't know what else.
Absolutely.
Well, again, 16 years old, you can't really do very much. And that day itself, nothing much happened, but it was from the morning afterwards. And then the morning afterwards, I went to see another friend of mine who was also a Sikh young woman. She was in a class ahead of me, and she lived near the university. And my house is, West Delhi is Rajendra Nagar, and our school was in Pusa Road, which is not far from there. So we went through, I remember this whole area called Filmistan, which is, and there's a tire market there, and I saw people being necklaced. I mean, they were the first, like, men being trapped with tires, and then the tires being set alight. So of course that was pretty horrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And then we tried to. I went to this girl's house, and her parents told me you just have to get home immediately.
Okay.
So then I found my way back home, and then we just were glued to the news, to the television news, because I think by the second day they had the body in the Timothy house, and the crowds of so-called mourners were appearing around the body and raising these slogans. Khun ka badla khun. That had already started.
Mm-hmm.
And then we heard reports of what was going on. What happened thereafter was that I think there were a few days of like being cooped in the house, and I was trying to get in touch with my girlfriend and her family. They lived in Greater Kailash Part 2, and there was I think there was a Gurpurab coming up soon after, the 1st of November in that year, and I somehow convinced her and her elder brother and her mother, these were the 3 people of their family, that they should come and live with us. And they then came to live and stay with my parents and me. And we were together for about 4 or 5 days. So that I remember very, very clearly. I personally think that November 1984 completely changed my life, because I could never see certain things in the same way before. I have, to this date, difficulty in trusting any person in a uniform, especially in a police uniform. And I know that's not necessarily a rational reaction, that one should evaluate people on the basis of what they do and what they say.
Mm-hmm.
But having seen the behavior of Delhi police in November 1984, having seen the fact that it was quite clear to me even at that time that this was not just spontaneous mobs on the rampage, but that they were being organized, and they were being led, and that they were being allowed to do what they were allowed to do, meant that my understanding of what the state in this country is, and therefore in general what the state is, and what the procedures of governmentality are, were very, very profoundly affected personally by what I saw. They continue to be affected by the fact that those we all knew were perpetrators of 1984 were never brought to justice. So that's at 2 levels. One is that we saw what we did then, and then over time we realized that the people who did this were never held to account. So, and that has meant that I have by now pretty robust degrees of skepticism towards all towards claims made on behalf of people by political parties or by governments in Delhi. And I think that comes out of a personal experience. There were other friends of mine in school, a young Sikh man whose families were attacked. They luckily they were able to escape in time. Nobody that I knew personally at that time lost life or was injured. But for instance, I had to do a couple of things. I had again, as I said, this young woman who was then my girlfriend, her brother, who I looked up to a lot. He was a very, at the age of 16, you kind of hero worship someone who's a little older and smarter. And he was very much like that for his sister as well as for me. He was a very bright guy. He was studying to be a doctor. He was extremely well read. He was kind of mentor figure. Right? So I remember having to shave him and cut his hair. And suddenly this person who was for me the most inspiring, like if you're a teenager, someone a little older than you seems close to you, but as well as very powerful. He seemed to suddenly shrink and become a much smaller person. I mean, that's true. If you take a young, a sick young man who has a turban, full head of hair and beard, and then you cut off the beard, then the person physically tends to become as if they were a smaller person. And I think that, I mean, I'll talk about it a little later, but he changed. And I could see that he changed as a result of this. So that I can see. The other thing that's important is that the following summer, there was a kind of, two things happened. First, as a student, then in 1984, immediately, the week after, many of us began going to the relief camps.
Yes.
And there were camps set up in different localities. I went to one in a school that was set up in Rajnivas Marg, or Rajpur Road, I remember. It was a government school, and these were families from that area who had been just given shelter there. And the immediate task was, there was a certain form, like you have a form, and we had to ask people questions.
Right.
How many members in your family? Was anyone killed? Is anyone injured? Is anyone missing? Where was your house? Did it get burnt or whatever? So there was an immediate practical need for this to be done. So I was involved, as were some of my other friends, in this task. We were given this task. And then subsequently, in the summer of 1985 that followed, the same group of people, my friends and I, there were about 5 or 6 of us, were volunteered to be part of a kind of summer camp for children and teenagers who had been orphaned from an area called Trilokpuri. And this summer camp, which was basically like in some senses a kind of space of extended therapy, I guess, by some educators and social workers, was a place where we could do little drama workshops, play games, tell stories. So the idea was that there were these children and young teenagers, and there would be other children and teenagers who would kind of interact with them and restore some sense of normal solidarity. So I was a part of that for that summer, and that was also a very strong impression, because talking to, as we had to, and we were in the Bhaiya Didi category. I mean, there were these, like, I was 17 by then. We were dealing with kids who were 12, 13, 14 and little younger. So the kind of conversations that we had with them, especially those of us who were not sick, because there was this and it was interesting and it was difficult to deal with this, with the fact that these children identified everybody who was not sick as an assailant, except us. So they would say, "Aap nahi ho," but baki sab hai. So that again was something that one had to think with a lot of times. I think it became something that marked my generation, I would say, in Delhi. A lot of us subsequently, I mean, I have realized that the close friends that I've made have always been people with whom we've been able to have this conversation. And that it sort of, like you said, like you began asking, I have been asked and have asked this question, where were you in November 1984? So, and somehow that is a marker. Yes. I don't think it's a marker for people older than us or for people younger than us. But for those who it's a kind of coming of age. So for those who stopped being children and became grown up very quickly that year, it is a marker. So that's something that that I have talked about a lot. Very recently, quite suddenly, by being in contact with a friend of mine who's a photographer, Gauri Gill. she's been doing these photographic projects with the survivors of 1984. It all suddenly came back again, and last year she invited me to do a small piece of writing, which I did for one of the small books that she's done. So again, it sort of came back again because.
Have you ever had nightmares or flashbacks about those days in
Yes.
1984?
Yes, not recently,
Right.
but I did have them. Specifically in relation to feelings of anxiety about the well-being and security of this young woman who was then my girlfriend. I mean, we have not been together for 20 years now,
Right.
but there was a time. I mean, but even after that, there have been. I've recalled waking up thinking that I must find out where she is. And I don't trust the Indian state. I never will. To understand what happened in November 1984, we have to look at what happened in June.
Yeah.
To understand what happened in June 1984, we have to go back to the ways in which everything started falling apart in Punjab in the late 70s and early 80s.
Right.
To understand that, and then there are patterns. Then you can. I mean, I've had persistent interest, for instance, in what happened in Kashmir since 1989. And then, obviously, these are situations in which the Republican consensus in India is not able to think through with a long-term vision how to deal with the question of with what happens when that what we all take for granted gets questioned, right? And then, I mean, obviously, you cannot understand November 1984 except for the fact that if you have, as we now in hindsight know, the incredible degrees of violence that were unleashed in June, and what that did to, again, a generation of possibly, and especially young men in Punjab.
Right.
It is not unconceivable to see what made them despair and what made them become full of rage, and what consequences that had. I mean, I have written about this, but the young man that I talked about, who I shaved, I have often thought of him as the last casualty of 1984. Many years later, probably more than 20 years later, I came across a news item in a newspaper about a man who had died alone in his house and had been found dead weeks, if not a few months later. From the description of the house, I immediately recognized that it was him. And I realized that what had happened was that this man, who was so extremely brilliant and such an inspiring person for me, had become a completely isolated human being who refused all contact with the world and basically operated on the basis of suspicion of everything and everyone. And although he was not physically harmed in 1984, I think being a very sensitive human being and being an intelligent and sensitive human being, he was harmed deeply psychologically. Others like him turned to other things, turned to what they understood to be resistance, perhaps to the path that was later termed terrorism. In the case of this young man, he lost his ability to hold himself as a center. And he basically decomposed into being a person who had no contact with anybody. So for me, he is the last casualty. He survived 1984, but he was not able to survive the silence and the denial of 1984. And I think that had there been better ways to think about what happened in 1984, someone like him would have survived. I also think that had 1984 been dealt with in terms of justice, we as a society would not have become the kind of people that gave rise to what happened in Gujarat in 2002. I see a direct relationship.
Yes.
That there was an understanding by political parties that you could get away with this. So if we understand that the Congress was able to get away with it in 1984, then the BJP was able to get away with it in 2002, and conceivably others might think the same. So unless the closure of 1984 for me is very important for everything else. People make the mistaken assumption that that in some ways it represents the violence of the partition continued. I don't think that is the case. In 1947, communities attacked each other. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs attacked each other out of an atmosphere of paranoia and insecurity. What happened in 1984 was violence that was allowed to happen by the state itself. So it wasn't communities attacking each other, it was bands of men being encouraged to use violence against entire populations. That's a qualitatively new kind of violence. And that's why it's very important for us to understand 84.